All right, it looks like we're live. Hi, everyone. This is Phil Carlton. I know a lot of you know me. I'm an educator for fighting and SVP worldwide, and my specialty has always been the software. And so I'd like to welcome you to the Summer Digitizing Camp. We're talking today about Point Create on the Mac. So I'm working on the Mac today in our CREATIVATE software. And I'm going to be talking about digitizing, and specifically, I'm going to dig into the Bezier tool, which is a kind of a professional drawing tool. We'll get a little bit more into it as we go. And I do want to introduce Meredith, who's in the background, and will be watching the window today for questions and feeding those to me as we go. So if you have a question as we go about the lesson, please toss it in the chat window, and Meredith will feed those to me. If you have a question about something outside of what we do today, we may not be able to get to those questions, but we will definitely go back through the chat and work through and get answers to those questions for you as well. Okay, so let's switch over to my screen, Meredith, and you can say hi if you want to, or you don't have to. No pressure.
Hello, everyone. Happy summer, July 1st.
Yay! So you're looking at a couple of pictures that have the design that we're going to create today. On the left side of the screen is a vest that featured a design. I actually originally did this design probably about a decade ago, and I've revisited a couple of times to this. So on the right side is kind of an updated version of it, and that's what we're going to be creating today. So let me go over to the CREATIVATE window. Now, for those of you who signed up for this when the software was still called MySonet, I want you to know that for our embroidery software, really the only change that's happened right now is just the name of the software changed from MySonet over to CREATIVATE. So regardless of which one you have installed on your machine, you'll be able to work through this lesson. You can watch it later on YouTube, follow back through the steps, and create this design yourself. And I'm going to talk through a little bit of this design. So I'm going to go ahead and select it, and I'm in CREATIVATE Embroidery. And I'm going to open up the design player for a second by clicking the play button over on the side. And let me see if I can just make this a little bit larger. And I'm going to just drag through and talk about some of the elements that make this design, and then we'll get into how it's created. So it's going to start by doing a multi-wave fill. So I'm going to use, I think, 4 different fill types for this design, and I will talk through those different types as we do them. A couple of things I want you to see, though. We're going to go through a couple of different fill types, and this entire design can stitch without any jumps. So we're also going to talk a little about how I plan to make that happen. So it's going to start with that multi-wave fill. It's going to come through with a satin stitch. Notice the satin stitch doesn't complete here on the bottom because I'm going to have a satin ring that comes around at the end, and I don't want that to get too bulky. Then here in the center, I guess, leaf of the fleur-de-lis. Is it a leaf? Does anyone know? I don't know. I'm going to call it a leaf. It has a curved crosshatch fill. Then it will do that satin stitch again. Then we'll go over to the right petal. Maybe petal's a better word. And it's going to have the multi-wave mirrored again. So we're actually just going to copy this one, flip it, and move it into place. Then it's going to do a little running stitch down to the bottom to move into place to do the bottom elements. And I'm going to do this with a spiral fill. So if you notice, it's kind of spiraling, getting a little heavier as it gets lower, and it's spiraling from kind of this area right here. It's going to finish that with a satin stitch. Move into position for the centerpiece, and it's going to do a gradient fill for that center as well. So notice it's a little heavier on the outsides and a little more open on the inside. It's going to finish with a satin stitch. And then on top of that satin stitch, I just added a triple stitch. I don't know if you can see that just a little bit or not, but it just adds a little bit of dimension to that satin, makes it a little bit more interesting, and gives it a little more character, I think. So before we go, do we have any questions that have popped up so far? Meredith. Pardon me.
Nothing so far. You're good.
I didn't figure we would, but I just thought I would check.
Of course.
Okay, I'm going to close that preview window, and I'm going to go ahead and go File, New, to start a new copy of CREATIVATE Embroidery. And I'm just going to tell it I want a blank canvas or a blank project. I'm going to click Next. And you may remember the first thing it does when we go through the blank project wizard is it's going to ask us what size hoop we want to work in. And we can, if I uncheck this, come in here and tell it what brand machine I have, which machine I own. So if I were going to Thoth, for example, I could find my machine and find my specific hoop. But for the most part, if I'm just setting a hoop size, I'm just going to come in and put a check mark in inner hoop size and just type those dimensions. I find that quicker and easier. And unless we're using something like the Grand Dream hoop or the Majestic hoop, a hoop that's going to flip and split the design, it really doesn't make any difference. So I've set this up for about a 6-inch square, 150 by 150 millimeters. And I'm going to click OK. I do want this to fill my screen, so I'm going to go Window, Zoom, and that's just on the Mac a really quick way to just fill the screen. And then I'm going to go over into digitizing. The first thing that I want to do is just talk a little bit about the fill types we're going to use. So to get to digitizing, I'm going to come to my tabs over on the right side, go to the Create tab, and under Insert, I'm just going to click Digitizing. Now, the nice thing that happens when I do it in this order, when I go into embroidery, I set up my 150 by 150 hoop. And if I do it in this order and then go over to digitizing, the thing that I like is if I open, it's now over in CREATIVATE Digitizing, it says I'm editing from embroidery. And if I open up my hoop, it has the same 150 by 150. So by starting in embroidery and then going to digitizing, I'm going to keep those hoops the same. It just makes it easier to make sure I know what size design I'm creating. Okay, now to look at this next part, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go to my quick create mode. So if you look over here across the top in the panel, I have 3 different modes that I can create when I'm digitizing. Quick create will fill a shape if I had artwork in the background, but I can also just bring in a shape. The second one is freehand create, and that would click and drag to draw. I almost never use that because I'm not very good at drawing. And the third one is point create, which is clicking to set points, and that's the one we'll use for most of the lesson. But the first thing I want to do is we're just going to work in quick create for a minute. And the first thing I want to look at is a multi-wave fill. So to set digitizing up for the fill, I'm going to look at this toolbar across the top, the second toolbar down. And this first setting right here is my fill type. I'm going to click the drop down and select multi-wave fill. And I am going to leave my satin line open. So every time, as a matter of habit, just to make sure I know what I'm doing and what I'm working on, I'm going to, once I select my fill and my line type, I'm going to come across this toolbar. I'm going to go to options. And because this area right here is affecting my fill and my line, if I choose fill area and line, it's going to open up the settings for the shape I've told it I want to create. Now, with the motif fill, there are a couple of things we can control. We can adjust the density by rolling it lower or higher. What I want you to remember, anytime we talk about density, density is the measurement between rows of stitches. So the higher the number, the higher the density, the more space, the more fabric you're going to see between rows of stitches. The lower it is, the lower the stitches are going to be, or the closer the stitches are going to be together. So if I went all the way to 2, it would look like a normal fill. I'm going to leave it at about the center, so about 20, something like that. I could also put a check mark and use motifs if I wanted to use a decorative stitch for this, but I'm not going to do that today. Then I also, because I told it I'm going to do a satin line, I want to go to my line tab. And for this, I think I'm going to set my width to just a 2 millimeter satin width right now. The default density, I think the default density is 4. I ran it down to a 3, which is just going to give me a nice full satin stitch. And I'm going to click OK. So now if I come here to this shape area and I've got a circle selected and I click the shape button, it's just going to create that circle for me. I'm going to move it up here into this corner, grab the corner to make it a little bit larger. And that is filled with a multi-wave fill. I'm going to go up to the top to my zoom tools for a second and do a zoom to rectangle and zoom into that one so we can see it. Now, what's nice about the multi-wave fill is I'm going to go over to point create for just a second. And on point create, I actually, if I select my multi-wave fill, I have a tool here called multi-wave line. And what's nice about the multi-wave line, or the multi-wave fill, is by default, it just kind of creates this serpentine fill. But if I click on multi-wave line, and if I set points, and I'm just going to set about 5 points in just kind of a random curvy line, I'm going to hit the right mouse button and choose Finish Point Multi-Wave Line. And now that fill is following the shape of those points that I created. So now I can really sculpt this fill to get a nice effect that I want. I can just kind of play with those until I'm happy with. Notice if it gets really, really sharp, it gets full. If you cross over, horrible things happen. But something like right there, you can start getting some really nice texture and really control how those lines behave. So that is the multi-wave fill, and we're going to use that one. Then I'm going to scooch over a little bit if I can do it without popping up that menu. I'm going to bring in, so I'm going to go back to Point Create. And the second one that I want to look at is going to be let me see, I believe a curved crosshatch or a crosshatch fill is the next one. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to go to curved crosshatch fill. And I'm going to insert that circle, just kind of move it into place here, make that just a little bit larger. And I do want to open up the properties of this for a second because I didn't come over here and look at my options first. So it just created it with the options that were already there. When you're working in digitizing, right now I have a box around this. If I right click, I can finish box select. Now I have this shape selected. If I click the right button again and select properties, it's going to open up the properties window for the object that I have already created. What I want you to see here is that on the curved crosshatch, I can have diamonds, and so that's going to be kind of like squares on point. I could change it to squares, and if I hit enter, now these lines are running more left to right and up and down. I'm going to right click and go back into my properties again. I can also have it do parallel lines, or I can even set any angles that I wanted. If I wanted this to be 30 degrees on the first line and I wanted the next one to be 137 degrees, for example, I can do that, and those are going to change. Now, the other thing I want you to notice, I'm going to make this a little easier by going back to square, is that on my curved crosshatch, I have 4 settings here in the center, curved lines 1 and curved lines 2, that change how those lines interact and how those curves behave. I can also choose whether I want it to be a running stitch, a triple stitch, depending on how heavy I want those stitches to be. Now, these little numbers right here under curved lines are kind of the tricky mystery lines. And I'm going to be honest, I don't really understand what the math of those does. But here's what's really nice. If I close that, you will notice that I have 4 little purple arrows here. And those arrows adjust these lines. So if I pull this one up, that line is going to follow those. So my up and down lines are changing how the curves work left to right. And the left and right are up and down, and the right ones and the left ones are changing those curves. So I don't really have to understand those lines because I can just use these control handles to really sculpt and get those curves behaving however I want. So do we have any questions before I go to the next example?
There was one question. Somebody just asked how wide the satin stitch was in the center of the fleur-de-lis that you had done.
We'll get through it when we do it, but I want to say from memory, it is I think I went to a 3 or a 3.5 on that one, but I will definitely talk through the different satins as we go through that piece.
Perfect. Thank you. That was it so far.
So it's not a very large design. I will say that I'm doing it at about a 4-inch size design. So I kind of say that a smaller size in those satin stitches just to kind of keep it proportional. If I was making that design larger, then I would also make my satin stitch a little larger. Okay, so the next one that I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a fill type of a spiral fill. Now I am going to follow my rule that I forgot last time. Go to my options, click fill area and line. And the same thing happens before on a spiral fill. I have something that I can adjust my density, and I can either have it do a constant or a gradient density. I'm going to start with a constant, and I'm just going to leave that at 15 for a second. I'm going to bring in a circle, make that a little bit larger. Oop, messed it up. Right click and finish that box select. So notice it's spiraling from the center. I have a little O here, which is the origin or the beginning of that spiral. If I move that origin, I am moving that spiral. So I can change the point from which it spirals out. And I can even take that spiral or the origin outside my shape to get a completely different look. And if I'm looking at that density, if I right click and go into my properties for the selected shape, if I make the density smaller, when I click OK, the lines are going to be closer together. If I were to take the density up to say a 25, they're going to be farther apart. Now, the other nifty thing I can do with the density, if I go into my properties, is I can tell it I want a gradient. And when I select a gradient, I can see a gradient bar has become highlighted below. And if I click the ellipsis, these three little dots, I can see right now it's going from a gradient of 2. Remember, that's going to be the density. So the lower the number, the tighter those stitches are. And it's going up to an 8. But I'm going to select this 8 one, and I'm going to take it to about a 20, just making something up here. And I'm going to click OK again, move my origin point in a little bit. And you can see now it started that origin really, really tight at the 2. And the further it gets into my shape, the wider those stitches are getting. So that little effect right there is kind of what we'll use in the fleur-de-lis. And along those same lines, I'm going to scoot over here and I'm going to do one more fill that may surprise you a little bit because I'm going to use a pattern fill in the center. I'm going to look at my properties here for a second, fill area and line. Pattern fills, as you know, are just when you're filling a shape entirely with stitches. It is by default using number 3, which is just a generic fill with no pattern in it. I am going to change my angle to 90 degrees so they're running left to right and click OK. I'm going to bring in this circle by clicking the shape button. And nothing too exciting happened there. I'm going to make that a little bit wider for this one. Nothing really exciting happened there, but if I open, I'm going to finish my block select and go into my properties. But if I open up my density quite a bit, so I've got a density right now of 2. If I take this to about a 15 and click OK, I want you to see what happens. So it spaced out my density, but what I'm seeing behind that right now is a lot of underlay. So if I'm using this type of fill and I want to have an open fill, I'm going to want to turn off that underlay, those support stitches, because I don't want to see them moving around. So I'm going to change my underlay to none and click OK. And that did pretty well, but if you will notice, I still have some traveling stitches inside this fill. And that is just the result of how the software creates a fill when it has a higher density. But there's a cool trick you can do here. If I go into my properties and I do the same thing I did over on the circle, if I go to a gradient and I'm going to click my dots, but if I I'm going to set my right gradient to 10, and I'm going to select my left number, and I'm going to set it to 10 as well. So even though I'm telling it that I'm going from density to density, I kept them the same number. But when I do that, the software knows that I'm going to be seeing the fabric because it knows I'm playing with my densities. So it does all the traveling around the outside. In addition to that, I can come in here and I'm going to go back into my gradient settings. I'm going to select the left one and I'm going to tell it I want it to add a marker. And I'm going to take this one. Let's take it to about a 4. So it's going to be tighter. Click OK. Click OK again. Now it's starting at the 10, gets heavier as it gets to the center, and then gets lighter as it goes back to the outside again. Okay, before I move on to the next step, does anyone have any questions about those, Meredith?
Nothing so far. Sorry, I couldn't. Or actually, here one just came through.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're good. I couldn't get my mouse to wake up.
I did see someone asked about an applique, and I know that there's an applique video coming soon. I'm not sure when that is, but I know that somebody is working on one of those. And I will also say, if you go to YouTube and search for my name, I have 4 videos out there on Premiere Plus 2. But if you search for Phil Carlton applique, I did 3 full videos that talk about the applique settings. And even though they were back in Premiere Plus 2, the settings are still the same here.
Perfect. Thank you, Phil.
So I selected these 4 shapes. I'm going to delete them for a second because I want to move on. So I'm going to edit, delete object to get rid of those. I want to move on to my next step, and that's going to be kind of talking a little bit about the Bezier tool. So the Bezier tool, just so you know, is kind of a drawing tool. It was created in the 60s by Pierre Bezier at Renault. So I'm guessing he was French because he worked for the car designer. And it's a digital drawing tool that uses math to create curves. So, you know, most of the time in our software, we create curves by just setting multiple points. So by default, just in the normal mode, I'm going to turn off my fill by clicking that button, or I could say no fill. So I've got a satin line. So in our normal mode, if I clicked and set points, as I click, I'm curving all around. If I hold down the shift key on my keyboard, I'm creating corner points. If I right click, and I'm going to finish that, then I've created that line. And I've done that by creating multiple points to create that curved line. I'm going to delete that because I don't want it. Now let's talk a little bit about the Bezier tool and how it works. So if you notice here, I'm on Point Create. I'm going to come over here to this section right next to Options, and I have a button for Bezier mode. Now, this works completely differently than the other tools. So on the other tool, remember, I clicked points for a curve, and I held down the Shift key for a corner. For this tool, when I go in, I'm going to click Create Area or Line. With the Bezier tool, if I want points, like corners, I just click. And if I right-click and finish that, I've gotten those points right there. What really is cool about the Bezier tool is when I click and drag, it creates handles for me. And what I want you to think of in this handle right now is if there was a line coming in from the left handle would change how it curves. A point going away on the right, this right handle would change how the right or the curve coming out of that point. So I'm just going to click and drag 3 or 4 points and see as I drag those, right click and finish that, it's created those curves because each one of these curves is just defined by 2 handles. So this curve that comes from my first point to the bottom point is being impacted by these 2 handles going into the curve and out of the curve. As I move and drag those curves, I can change how that behaves. And I can get some really nice curvature on these points just by dealing with these 1 handles. What I do want you to see though, right now, they're staying fairly symmetrical. So if I adjust the left handle, it is automatically adjusting the right handle. Same thing here. If I adjust the left handle, it's adjusting the right handle. However, if I hold down the Shift key on my keyboard, now as I pull a handle, it's just pulling one of them at a time. So I'm able to control these points just on one side. And that's how you start getting really specific curves. And that's truly all there is to it, other than it just takes a little while to kind of get used to how these curves behave. So I think I have another window open I want to go to. Oh, maybe I don't. Maybe I closed it. So let's grab that real quick. I'm going to open this in CREATIVATE. And it looks like now y'all can see these shapes. So I want to talk a little bit about just using the Bezier tool for a second to create these. So I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to just do a crosshatch inside these because they're complete shapes. Let me see. I think those settings all look fine. So if I was doing the square, I'm going to zoom in a little bit by grabbing my zoom tool and zooming in here. So to do the square, I'm going to turn on Bezier. And remember, all I have to do for a corner is just click. So if I click and click and click and click, when I right click and finish that, it's created that square with the 4 points, very similar to what the other tool would do. But let's scroll over here to this circle for a second. Pardon me, I'm so sorry. I'm going to turn on my drawing tool again. And now for this circle, I'm going to start at the beginning. I only need to do 4 points. And if I click and drag to the right about 2 grids, or about half the width of the circle, and do that all 4 times. Well, I double clicked and bad things happen. So I hit Control Z. Let's try that again. I'm going to do that one. Click and hold to do that one. Now I'm nervous. I'm going to double click again. I'm going to do the bottom one. And I'm going to do this side one. And I just did that by going about 2 grids up on each side all the way around. Right click. Now I do want to point out when I right click, I have 2 different options here. My top option is finish drawing the line. If I do that, it will complete this shape, but leave the tool active so I can go on to my next shape. If I choose finish Bezier or freehand Bezier area or line, it's going to finish the shape and deselect that tool. Look it up, and there it is. That circle's pretty close. Now I can just come in here and adjust that handle a little bit if I want to and fine tune it a little. And that's how easy it is to make a pretty perfect circle. I do want to talk about one other thing we're going to use a little bit in here before I go to the next shape, and that is our view mode. So it's a little off my screen here, but I do have a little button here. I can go to either object, 3D, or 2D. You can also find it under view. If I go view mode, object mode, that can be very, very helpful because I can see, and I know it's a little hard for y'all to see probably, but I can see my line while I'm editing it. Even though the stitches are there, they're temporarily hidden, so all I can see is just the object or the lines that are making that object. Now let's scroll down just a little bit more. And I want to talk about this cloud. I'm going to zoom in for a little bit, and you're going to notice I cheated a little bit. I have a couple of guides here so you can see kind of how these lines are going to work. But I'm going to start in the lower left-hand corner and work my way clockwise. And I'm going to do this cloud a couple of different times so you just kind of get a feel for what it does. And the first time I'm going to do it, I believe, let me make sure, view mode. I'm still in object view, so it'll make it easy for us to see the shape. First of all, I'm just going to kind of click and drag where I created a red X. And I'm not going to worry too much about these angles for a second because I want you to see me edit it, and then I'll kind of build it how I would actually do it. There's that one. I'm going to right click and finish that. Now that clearly doesn't look much like a cloud, but if I hold down the shift key on my keyboard and start adjusting these curves, you're going to see that very quickly I'm able to shape that cloud. And to get this using our old method, we would need a lot more points to get nice smooth curves. And the nice thing about this is because I don't need a whole bunch of points to get that smooth curve, let me go view mode, 3D view. It's that I'm getting really, really pretty curves here without having to set 3 or 4 points, or in this one, I'd have to set probably 5 or 6 points to get that curve. And if I edit it, I'm going to have to fine tune a bunch of different points. So let me cut that piece. Now watch how I'm actually going to do this. And I'm going to do it by toggling my shift key on and off. So I will talk to you as I do it. But regardless of where you start, I usually work clockwise. That's just my habit. So what I want you to think is the first thing I do when I click and drag, I am defining what the curve is going to do as it comes into the point that I'm creating. Then I'm going to hold the shift key down, and I've defined the curve as it goes out of the point I'm creating. Now I'm going to click to define the curve coming in, hold the shift key, define the out, lift up my shift key, define the shape of it coming in, hold the shift key, define it coming out, lift up the shift key, and that, define that one, hold this shift right here. This one right here over on the right side, now I'm basically just doing half of the circle we did, so I just need to drag it down. Drag this one across a little bit. Right click, finish that. And I've done that shape in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points. So how did I decide? I saw a question, how did I decide where I wanted the points? Well, the main thing that I did is anywhere that there was a junction, I added a point. And the only other rule that I made is kind of if I was going into, or I was in a very, very tight curve. So I added another point here just because, I could probably do this one over here by going way, way out here and coming way out here. So I could have done it even without that one. But for me, it was much easier. Let's delete that. It was much easier on this one. Let me finish that and undo it. Just to kind of draw a small one. And then I thought about this as just part of the curve. And I did that. So hopefully that kind of helps. It really does just kind of take practice. And the more you play with the curves, the more you'll kind of figure out. But if it's a really, really tight curve, you may only need 1 point to create it. And there are going to be a couple of points in the fleur-de-lis where I'll show that for sure. So let me see. Do I have any other questions? I don't see any, but do I have anything before I go to the design itself?
I don't see anything else. That's great so far.
Okay, so let me quit this digitizing page. And I guess it didn't want me to save it. That's fine. I'm going to quit this one. I don't need it. I'm back in embroidery. I'm just going to delete all that because I don't need it. So I'm going to go edit, delete. So I'm back in embroidery now. I could go back to the file menu and do a new window, but I'm basically here at a blank hoop anyway. So I'm just going to stay here. I am going to change my hoop size here to a 120 by 120. So that's going to be roughly a 5-inch hoop, a little less. And then I'm going to pop back into digitizing again. Here I am still on the Create tab. I'm going to click Insert. It's going to open up an occurrence of digitizing for me. And I can tell because I know my grid's at 10, so I've got a 120 by 120 hoop. And now I do need a little bit of artwork. And the artwork for this project is actually over in Draw and Paint. So Draw and Paint is a module that was added for my Sonnet that's now in CREATIVATE. And it is designed for creating artwork. But basically what I want you to think about when I go to Draw and Paint is I'm opening a drawing or an image or creating artwork that is going to be in the background of my working area. So it is in the background creating artwork for me to digitize on top of. So if I come over here to the background section and I click on the third button here, which is Edit Background, it will open up Draw and Paint for me in a 120 by 120 hoop. So it's really nice if we think about the way that flowed. I started in embroidery, I went over to digitizing, and I went over to Draw and Paint, but I haven't had to launch all those different programs. The program takes me to what I need to do based on what I tell it I want to do. And it just lets me move back and forth through those. So I want to insert some artwork. So I'm going to go to the Insert tab. Down here on the Insert tab, I have a design gallery. If I click on that, it's going to bring up a bunch of built-in pieces of drawings of art. There they are. I'm going to scroll down. These are categories in alphabetical order. I'm going to go down to ornaments, I believe. There's my fleur-de-lis. I'm going to select it, click Insert, then close that window. It's come into my window. I do want to make it a little bit larger. I could drag it out by hand, but I'm going to do it using a little map just so it's nice and perfect. I'm going to go to the Draw tab. And on the Draw tab toward the bottom in the Edit area, I have a button called Transform that will let me resize it by typing in numbers. I want to change the height and width. I want it to be 100 millimeters tall. I am going to click on this little padlock. So when I change my height, if I can type 100, it's going to expand it and keep it nice and proportional for me. I'm going to close that. I've now got that artwork loaded into the window of Draw and Paint. If I go CREATIVATE Draw and Paint, quit CREATIVATE Draw and Paint, it's going to close Draw and Paint, take me back over into embroidery where that image is now loaded in my background. Really, really nice, clean way to get that artwork there. And now we're ready to start working through the design. And I've got to turn a couple of pages to make sure I haven't missed anything here. So I've got my hoop size. Okay, so I think I'm ready to work through this design. And like I said, the first thing we're going to do is this little petal over here on the left side. So I'm going to go up to my zoom tools, click and drag a box around that left petal. So I did a zoom to fit, zoomed into that left petal. And now I need to set up the fill and line that I want for this. And so for this first one, I'm going to do a multi-wave fill with a satin line. I'm going to go look at my options, fill area and line. And for this one, I want the density. I just set it to 20, which is, I think, the default, but it looked right for this size design. I don't need any motifs. I'm going to go to my line tab and just see what I've got going on here. So I do want this line to be a little bit wider. I think it would be about a 3 millimeter. And I'll just leave the density at 3. I think that will be fine. I am going to leave a check mark in underlay because underlay is going to give it a little stability as it draws that satin stitch or builds that satin stitch. So let's say okay. And now I'm ready to create this first line. So I'm going to remember, I'm very proud of myself, to turn on Bezier since that's what we're talking about today. So I'm in digitizing. I'm on the Point Create tab. I've turned on Bezier and I'm going to click on Create Area or Line. And I want to start at this point right here. And I actually have a specific reason to do that, and it will make sense because I want to end here because that's going to put me in line to move to my next shape. So I'm going to, first of all, I think I'm going to do this the same way I did before. I'm going to click and drag. That looks like half a circle, so I'm going to click and drag here. I'm not defining these. Well, I double-clicked again. Careful, kids. If you do, I just hit Control-Z to get rid of that. So I'm just kind of defining these where I can see big curves. A lot of it is really just like that circle and I'm going to lower that one. I'm going to right click. I'm going to finish that area. Beautiful. It couldn't look better. Wait, maybe it could. So let's edit it a little bit. But I am going to turn on my object view for a second. I'm going to hold down my shift key because remember the shift key is going to let me adjust these points separately. So that one looks good. Now I think I can just adjust this one. This one, I think I need to expand a little and maybe do that. So remember, with any curve, 2 points are defining it. So to adjust this curve, I kind of just adjusted the 2 points, one coming into the curve, one coming out of the curve. This one has a much wider curve, so I think I need a much wider line. I'm going to take this one up here to define that line. Now, the only thing that I need, you notice this has got a little block that kind of comes down here. So I need to take this end point and just point it in so that I know that that curve comes in this direction and goes out that direction. Now, if I go view, view mode, 3D, I've got that line nice and created. I'm going to cut that by hitting Command Z. And now I'm going to draw this kind of how I would actually do it, just so you see a little more of how the tool works. So I'm going to turn on Create Area or Line again. So if I start here, I think about what the line's going to do coming into that point. So I start with the line parallel. I'm going to hold down the Shift key, tell it I'm going to be moving up. Then I'm going to drag this to define that curve. This is kind of like that circle, so I don't think I need to worry about the X. There we go. Hold down my Shift key, point into the next curve. Then I'm kind of treating this like a circle. So I'm just going to define those by pulling to the right. Define this one by pulling down. Hold down the Shift key, point back into that curve, right click and finish that. And that's all it takes to really define how that curve behaves. Now, there are a couple of things I want to do with this in addition. First of all, I do want to add some multi-wave lines. Notice it's got that little serpentine default curve. Then I'm going to turn on my multi-wave line tool. And I can't use Bezier in this tool, so I'm just going to set 4 points to create a nice curve there, right click and finish that point. And I love the way that kind of just shapes into that shape. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about for a second is what's happening down here at the bottom. I don't want this heavy satin stitch here at the bottom because I'm going to come in at the end with a heavier satin on that oval, and I don't want those built over. So the first thing I'm going to do is right click and go into the properties of this object. And if I go to the line tab, I can uncheck this up at the top, closed border, and click OK. And it now did not add the final segment of that line. So it doesn't have that satin stitch at the bottom. But that has created another little kind of weird thing that happens, and we need to remember it. When we have a fill, the fill will always by default start and end at the same place. But it has an outline around the outside now that is going up, down, and then over and around. And this line is actually ending here, even though the software says it is ending here. It's a weird thing that happens when you don't use that closed border, or when you turn off the closed border. So if I come under Object and use Break Apart, it's going to take this into two objects, my fill, which is going to start and end here. Now, if I select my satin line, it's going to start here, and notice my end marker is here. So I'm actually in position for that next shape. So we'll do that a couple of more times just because it's a little funky to get that rhythm, but hopefully you can see how breaking that apart, I can see the fill and the line, and then I can really pay attention to where my shapes are starting and ending. Now I want to get into position to do this next line, and I could change to a running stitch, but I also have a tool on my Point Create called Single Stitch. And the job of Single Stitch, the only thing it does is it stops, this little pink cursor right here is where my design ended. All Single Stitch does is go from that cursor to wherever I click. So if I clicked right here, it would add one super long stitch. That's not where I want it, so I'm going to click undo. But I do want you to think about the fact that that stitch would have been like over an inch long. So if I go into CREATIVATE Digitizing Settings, there is a setting here that isn't on by default that I recommend you turn on that says break up into maximum lengths of and I did for 3 millimeters for the single stitch. So that if I did a single stitch that was longer than 3 millimeters, it would break it into pieces instead of adding a huge jump stitch. In this case, I don't need it because I have single stitch and I'm just going about a millimeter or two. And I'm now in position when I right click to do that next shape. Okay, any questions about, yeah, I see Beth say yes. You'll probably want to work through, and the nice thing is you can kind of work through maybe with it on an iPad or on a screen or on your phone, give it a shot, and I would love to see people do this design as well, just to kind of see what happens. Okay, I'm going to adjust my view so I can see the center petal. Now this one, I believe I'm going to do with the curved crosshatch. So I'm going to change my fill type to curved crosshatch fill. And as always, I'm going to then go into my options to look at the settings because I don't know what I did last time and it may be very different from what I want to happen this time. So I do want to keep this at diamond, and because I just think that shape worked well. I do want to change the angle of the diamonds to a 60, which is going to make a little more on point diamond. And the other thing that I changed is I do want to go from a running stitch here to a triple stitch. And the reason I'm doing that, anytime I have that option, if I'm doing some kind of a design where I'm really letting stitch fill patterns instead of just a fill, if I'm letting some kind of fancy fill do the decorative work, then I want those stitches to be heavy enough that that thread really shows up. And a running stitch, it may look a little bit wispy, but by going to a triple, I know it's going to go forward, back, forward, and I'm going to get nicer buildup of that stitch. And then I'm going to take this to, I could take it to a 2.5, maybe even a 3, because there isn't a lot of curve in that stitch length. And the main thing we think about when we're setting stitch lengths for a running stitch or a triple stitch is how much curve is going to be on this line, because in fact, I think I'll take it down to 2.5, because we know from sewing that the longer your stitch length is, as you do curves, the chunkier it's going to look. So let's click OK. And on this one, I think I actually am ready. So I've got that set. I'm going to click here. So I do want to click and set my first point on the pink create cursor so that I know that it is connected and will sew without a jump stitch. I also want to think about what is happening as it comes in here to the edge. So I'm going to just click and drag a little to the left to define the curve coming in, then hold down my shift key, and I'm just going to kind of point up because this is a very, very, not very sharp curve at all. So I think that's all the movement that I needed to get that nice, pretty curve. Can y'all see that artwork okay? Can you see the lines if I'm doing it? I'm actually going to come into my background, go to fade background, and take that down just a little bit more. So hopefully you can see the lines that I'm drawing. Now, for the top point, there is just a little blurb of a curve up here at the top and on the right side. It's not really symmetrical though, and I just decided it looked fine just to click and add a corner up there and just have that as a nice smooth curve. Now, all I need to do is just mirror the left side with the right side. Then I'm going to come in here and just mirror again, pay the tension coming into that curve, hold my shift key to find that little piece right there, right click, and I'm going to finish that. Now that looks decent, but I think we can do better by just adjusting these arrows a little bit. I'm kind of cheating because I know roughly where I want them, but really it was all just experimenting until I was happy with the way, oh, undo that. I grabbed the node instead of the curve point. So I'm just kind of adjusting those little triangles until it looks pretty centered in my shape. And I think that looks pretty nice. Okay, now I do need to do the same thing that I did before. I am going to come in here. I'm going to go Object, Break Apart. Oh, no, Edit, Undo Break Apart. It probably would have been fine, but I want to do this in the right order every time. First, I want to right-click and go into my Properties, go to my line, turn off the closed border so it doesn't finish across the bottom. Then I'm going to go Object, Break Apart. Now I can see that I'm ending right here in place for the next shape. And thank you, Beth, for telling me that it is mostly visible. I'm never quite sure. I want to make sure that it's as visible as it can be for y'all. Then I'm just going to do a single stitch and move into place to get that next line. Right click and finish single stitch. Now, like I said, I'm just going to grab this one and copy and mirror it and put it into place here. It is going to be much easier to do if I go to my view mode and go to object view so I can just see my outlines, then I'm going to grab my multi-way fill, hold down my shift key, and grab my satin line. Then I can just go edit, duplicate selected. I'm going to move that down to the bottom of my film strip so it's in the right order. I'm going to flip it, and then I'm just going to use those outlines to move it into shape. And I'm going to click off of that. And I'm going to actually right-click on this, and I'm going to ungroup this because I don't really need it to be grouped. And it looks like those are not quite touching. If you look at my film strip, between objects 7 and 8, between the single stitch and that multi-way fill, those objects are not touching. So let's figure out why. So first of all, if I look at my multi-way fill now, because I mirrored it, my start and end were on the left side. Now they're on the right side. So with a fill, I can just finish that box select. I can just move my start point and my end point. Now my line has moved down because now my line thinks it's starting here and ending here. But that's not really what it's doing, because with a line, well, I mean, it is what it's doing now. But with a line, I can't just move my start point and end point. The software will let you do it, but just as a warning on a line, if you switch the start and end points, it will look fine, but when you get to your machine, it will add a jump stitch. So instead, if you need a line to run the other direction, you want to go Object, Reversal, Reverse Line. That switched my start and end points, and notice now if I look at my film strip, I don't have any horizontal lines in here. So I know it is going to move through this entire design so far without any jumps. So I'm just going to make sure that my satin line is selected, so I'm on my last object of my film strip. Now I need to move into place to do this bottom shape, and then we'll come back in and get that center oval. So to do that, I can't really do a single stitch because I can't travel straight down here. I could do a bunch of single stitches, but I do think it's going to be easier if I go no fill, turn on a running stitch. I am going to look at my fill area and lines. I have a 2 millimeter length for my running stitch. That is fine to get through this curve. So now I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so y'all can see it a little bit better. I'm going to just turn on my create area or line. And basically what I'm seeing here again is half of a circle. So I'm going to click and drag a little bit, click and drag on the side here, click and drag to finish that circle. And then I'm just going to click one time to add that point, right click and finish that. And if I go back to my view mode and go back to 3D view, you can see now I've added a running stitch down into place for that bottom piece. Okay, do we have any questions, Meredith, before I go on to the next one? I know I've rambled for a bit. I've kind of been glancing over.
Somebody was asking about if they had the ability to do this within the Gold Perpetual software.
So in Gold, you do have some wizards that will let you run through and create some designs, but you don't have the digitizing tools. Now, one of the things that I do love about Gold that I always say I prefer over the silver version, or I think they're intermediate, I can't remember what they're called. I'm CREATIVATE now. I'm so very sorry. But that middle version does let you go in and edit and make changes to designs, which I think is really important, because if you have a design, say, with a flower or multiple flowers, and you just want to use one of the flowers, I love the ability to go in and edit that. But that the Gold package does not have the digitizing tools. But if you talk to your dealer, they will be happy to tell you more about that. Okay, so now for this bottom petal, we are going to use, it will come as no surprise to those of y'all who watched the beginning part, I'm going to do a spiral fill. I'm going to go back to my satin line. I'm going to go into my fill area and line options. And I think I'm going to do spiral fill. We looked at the gradient, so I'm going to go ahead and use the gradient. And I think I'm going to set the gradient. I'm going to start at a 20. Did I do it? Nope. Typed a bad number. I'm going to start at a 20, and I'm going to end at a 4. Let's see if I did that right. We'll find out in a second. My line is still at my 3 millimeters. It's perfect. Okay, and you may remember that I talked a little bit about if there's not a heavy curve or a really sharp curve, I don't necessarily need 2 sets of handles, and I'm really going to let that do some work for me. So the first thing I'm going to do here this time, and it really is just experimenting, is I could click and drag, but I'm just going to add a corner here because I know that I can define that curve really easily by just doing that. Then I'm going to again define the curve coming out of it by going into a shift, lift up my shift key, define that curve. Not really happy with what I did, so I'm going to hold down my shift key and fine tune that a little bit. Then I'm going to take this one and just run it straight down. And then for the bottom here, I can just click, bring that down a little bit lower. Now I've done half of it, so if I'm doing the other half, I truly just have to mirror what I did on the right side. So I'm just looking at the length of my handles and kind of the angle of those. And I'm going to define that, come into here, do a click here, smooth that out just a little. I'm also a very strong proponent of nobody's going to see your artwork when you're done. So if it comes out looking pretty close, you're fine. Don't overthink it. Don't spend 8 hours fine tuning to make sure it's 0.5 millimeter into place, because when it's thread on fabric, it's not going to matter. Now I'm going to right click and finish that. There's my spiral, but I'm going to move that up, and now we can see that spiral starting at the open density and getting heavier as it moves down. Need to do the same thing with this piece right here. I'm going to right click, go into my properties, go to my line, uncheck closed border. So now I've got my space open. Now I'm going to break this apart. And that moved my end over here, which gets me into place to kind of do my final circle. So I just think that's a really kind of cool way to do that. So the last thing I'm going to do, we talked about this, it was the fourth fill type that we talked through. I did a pattern fill. Then I'm going to go look at my options here. Now for this one, I do want to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to leave that at 90. I don't really need to turn off, I'm going to turn off my underlay so that we can't see it under my gradient. And I'm going to actually turn on a gradient, go into my dots here, and I'm going to start it at a 6. I'm going to end at a 6. And with this right one selected, I'm going to click Add Marker because it always adds a marker to the left of the selected one. And I'm going to take this one up to a 20. Then I'm going to click OK. Now, I want to say, for those of you who are like, how did I know 6 or 20? There's no magic formula for that. I just typed in numbers, and when I liked what it looked like, I wrote it down. So don't think I just went, oh, this needs to be a 13.2, because those all happen by just experimenting and seeing what it looks like. Click OK there. I still got Bezier selected, so I'm going to now click here. Now, this is such a sharp little curve. I'm going to tell you that I can do this one by I did a corner point here. I'm going to do a corner point here. Then I can just click and drag up because that's such a small curve that I didn't really need multiple curved lines to define it. And I'm going to come back to here.
Hey, Phil.
Yes.
Someone was asking, how do you get your middle 2 points in the bottom petal to match? One is a point and one is a
thank you. Good eye. And I meant to look for that, and I actually had written about that. So yes, thank you very much. Let me finish this one, and then I will fix that because that's super important. So thank you, Nancy, for keeping me honest. So first of all, there's that little centerpiece. I made it a little bit heavier, I think. Did I? Let's look. Line. No, I didn't. I wanted to. So I'm going to go to this line, and I'm going to bump it up to about a 3.5 or a 4, just because I thought the middle needed to look a little bit heavier. Actually, I took it to 4, and I think I liked a 3.5 more. So yes, let's talk about that bottom piece, because something horrible happened, and that's okay. So what happened here is when we get something that is a really sharp turn like this, the software, let me see if I can go into my view for a second, and I'm going to go to 2D view for a second. These are going to be kind of hard to see, but I'm going to zoom way in. So what happens when it does a curve is it uses something called stitch shortening. As it gets into this point, it's going to use some satin stitches, but it's going to adjust the width of these stitches coming in here to create those really long points. But what can happen if our curves are really, really sharp is sometimes they can get so long that the software knows that the machines would think they were jump stitches. So all I need to do is select this satin line, and I'm just going to fine tune that just a little bit. And I think if I just adjust the angle, usually I don't find it quite this much. There it went. So I just kind of have to fudge that angle until it matches. And I just did that by just adding a little less. Notice when I get it really sharp, it goes away. If I open it up just a little bit, it comes back. So Nancy, thank you very much for catching that for me. Let me go back to my view mode. And I'm going to go back to 3D again. And the last thing that I want to do here is I'm going to select this bottom one, and I'm going to change to a lighter color because I think it's going to be easier to see. So I'm going to go to just a light blue color. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste that object right on top of it. So right now I have a fill on top of a fill, but if I open up the properties of that one by right-clicking and going into properties, and I'm going to tell it I don't want this to have a fill, and I want this to be a triple stitch. And let's take this stitch length to about I think this one's a pretty tight curve, so I'm going to take it to a length of 2. Click OK, and then I'm going to click off of that so you can see, and you can see it just added a triple stitch right in the middle of that satin line. So it just, for me, makes it a little classier and gives it a little more visual interest. Now that design is completely finished. Now I'm going to make it a little darker because I think I made it too dark. So how about that's a nice pretty color. And I'm going to go to view, and go to 3D view. So now what we have to do now when we're done creating this design is I'm just going to go to digitizing and quit digitizing. That's going to take me back over into the embroidery mode where I can save that VP4 file. So it's so important when you're working in digitizing and you're working like this, where you start an embroidery, go to digitizing, do all of this work, save that VP4, because what I want you to see is if I save the VP4 and come back later, when I open up that VP4, with it selected, when I hover over it, it tells me it's the design object. If I click on Edit Design, it's going to open that back up in digitizing for me so that I can make changes to my digitized object. That same logic carries through, because if I tell it I want to look at my background or edit my background, it's going to open up Draw and Paint for me where I can see my artwork. So all of that information, when I quit Draw and Paint and quit digitizing and save that VP4, is how it's going to remember everything so I can edit it later. If I've added text, the VP4 is going to let me edit it later. If I've used super designs, I can come back and resize them later. So the VP4, very, very important. And then when you're ready to embroider, that's when you go File, Export, and select the format you need for your machine. I always recommend using a VP3 for the export for a couple of reasons. Number one, that way I have a VP4 that I know is the one I can edit, and my VP3 is my final one that's been combined, been color sorted. If it had multiple designs, it's just going to give me a nice clean version. And also, some of our older machines don't read the VP4 format. So regardless of what format or what Viking machine you're using, that VP3 format is going to work for you. Okay, Meredith, I think I'm there. You do not. So Beth asked, you don't have to save a separate EDO. Now you still can. If you feel comfortable, you can. And when I'm designing something, I may save several EDOs so I can go back to that place. But as long as you have this VP4, you can always get back to that file. So it is much nicer, because if I had done this in like Premiere Plus 2, I would have created the artwork and I would have had to save it. Then I would have had to create digitizing, gone in, inserted the artwork, exported my file from digitizing, then inserted it into embroidery to add anything around it. So it really does make that whole process nice and clean. However, if you feel better saving your artwork from Draw and Paint, you can absolutely do that. If it makes you feel more comfortable to save your EDO, absolutely do that. The only thing I want you to remember, and then I will quit talking, I promise, is when I go into digitizing, I want you to watch up here, because I'm going to start another digitizing, and a message is going to pop up that says, oh, right here, opening digitizing. Now I'm going to minimize this for a second. Notice this has a finish button. If you click finish, it will break that section. away, and it will not automatically save. So never click finish from here. Always click finish by coming into digitizing and quitting, which is going to get that message out of the way. Okay. And Beth says, yes, there are fewer steps. Yes, one of the really nice changes that happened in my SONET was the way it saved those files and let us move back and forth, because even though we have multiple module still, it could sometimes be confusing to know what I need to get to. Now the software just knows. So if this was a Stitch file instead of a digitizing file and I clicked Edit Design, it would open it up in Stitch Editor automatically for me. If it was a Super Design and I clicked Edit Design, it would open up the Super Design properties. So it's gotten very, very smart without us having to remember, oh, I need to go to this module now to do this and save this piece. So huge fan of that. So do we have any other comments or questions, Meredith?
I think that's it. Somebody did ask, will this be available later? And all of our lives are recorded, so you can watch them at a later time. A new thing with Facebook, though, is after 30 days, they sort of go away, but they can all be found on our YouTube page. So you can go to the CREATIVATE North America, I forget the whole thing, but if you go to CREATIVATE embroidery software, something like that on YouTube, you'll be able to access it there for forever, or as long as YouTube's there.
It hasn't gone away yet, so hopefully.
Right. Yes.
Excellent. So I would say, Meredith, number one, it's been a pleasure because I don't get to talk to you very much anymore. So I'm so excited you got to join me today. And for everyone else, I just want to say thank you so much for joining. Like I said, I'll go back through the comments if you have other questions, but it would make my day for y'all to work through this and for me to see what you do with this design. So thank y'all very much, and I hope you have a fantastic day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Phil. I appreciate it.
I'll talk to you later, Meredith. Bye.